It's been so long.
I'll take the roll.
All right.
Mayor McEachern?
Here.
Councilor Tabor?
Here.
Councilor Cook?
Here.
Jane Freeney? And I'm here.
And first, I'll wait a motion to approve the minutes of February 23rd, 2024.
So moved.
Second?
Any discussion on that? All in favor?
Aye.
Next, we have the discussion of the NHMA 2025-2026 proposed legislative policy positions and legislative principles in order to present recommendations regarding these principles, policies and principles to the City Council at our Monday meeting, which will then allow us to take part in the NHMA policy conference on the 27th. Jane, would you like to lead us in this discussion?
I'd be happy to. So what I provided to you folks is a paper copy, and the highlight in yellow is the language that was changed from 2 years ago when we approved it. So it might be a little bit easier to kind of examine the policies. So there are really 4 things. First is the principles, which is the first document, which are just like our legislative principles. They're these broad statements that allow NHMA to lobby on behalf of its membership based upon those broad statements and of legislative principles. And then you have about 10 pages of the legislative policies, which are more targeted and specific for various topics. There are 3 general areas. One is local authority and efficiency. The second area of policies is finance. And the third is sort of an infrastructure and development. So they do those 3 topics every year. And then there are 2 quote-unquote floor policies, and those are policies that were submitted by an individual town that were not vetted in advance by NHMA and put into their policy principles, but will be voted on separately at the conference. So moving backwards again to the principles, the only new one is number 12. And that states to support the rights of cities and towns to advocate individually or collectively for or against legislation and to join, hire, or establish organizations to do so on their behalf. That is presumably in response to the anti-lobbying bills that have really gained momentum over the last several years in the legislature, which would make NHMA basically ineffective and unable to serve its membership. And also, a lot of towns are in various coalitions, as we are, the Coalition Communities 2.0, which also has a lobbyist on the issue of education funding. So that's the new policy, and all of these other policies are the same ones as I mentioned that have been moved and approved for the 23-24 season. So do you want a motion to approve them all, or do you want to pull any out? How do you want to proceed?
I would love to ask a question
Sure.
about the principle number 3 around local authority
Yes.
and all local government. I've struggled a little with this because New Hampshire Municipal Association uses this principle to then lobby against mandatory zoning changes, mandatory
Yes.
upzoning. And in some ways, that hurts Portsmouth, and they lobby directly against some of our state reps and state senator on some of these issues. So I don't know how we get them to develop a more nuanced view on local control here, because the reality is there's so many areas where we're not allowed to do anything because we don't have enabling legislation. But at the same time, they're lobbying to not create any legislation. And that does not help us as a community.
Well, you as a committee could recommend not approving paragraph 3 if you thought that was appropriate for council. The other way to do this is to, when these policies are created, local elected officials and representatives from the membership actually helped draft and create. We could propose a floor policy, just like the one at the end of the packet, which would perhaps amend that particular principle. Maybe you carve out, with the exceptions of land use, or, you know what I mean? Maybe there are issues relative to housing that they could either be more subtle or carve that out, so that there isn't this conflict between, as you said, some of these proposals in legislation that would help housing, but yet would not be local control, would be statewide zoning changes.
Right.
So which one are you on, Councilor?
Proposed principle number 3, advocate to maintain and enhance existing local authority in all areas of local government.
Sorry, I'm not seeing, is it on this page?
It's on the last page.
Last page, yeah. Proposed
Of the packet.
principles.
Of the packet.
Yeah, try the last page. I reordered mine.
Oh,
Sorry about that.
So what you're really saying is
oh, sorry. Yeah.
maintain and enhance existing local authority, except for legislation that creates more housing.
Yeah. That's my concern, is that they come out actively lobbying against some of the housing
Right.
legislation last year, and we really need it because they're concerned about taking away local control. And I think that there could be more nuance there. I don't want to advocate for taking away any local control, but at the same time, there are certain measures that would be helpful to us at the local level that we're not getting past.
Maybe an example?
Mandatory upzoning was one of them, where they were trying to get fourplexes allowed in all single-family residential zoning, which would, or 2 ADUs approved in residential zoning was the one last year that was defeated too. The New Hampshire Municipal Association came out opposed to that, which would have increased density of housing.
But that doesn't change our ability to do that.
No, we can oppose it, but I think that maybe we should just, footnote, hey, there should be some nuance here. I don't want to oppose this principle in theory, but I want to say we need some more nuance when you're looking at this, because not all of your members agree that you should come out opposed to some statewide policies around housing, because the state initially enacted the ADU ordinance that required us to allow ADUs. That's a benefit to us when it comes to housing. And we don't want the New Hampshire Municipal Association necessarily lobbying against proposals like that, I would think. So.
Yeah, I'm not, I guess, don't know how, the NHMA is limited in what they can get all municipals or all towns and cities to agree to. I've always viewed them as like that's the local control out of all the principles is the principle that gives them weight against the State House at times forgetting that they serve the towns and municipalities which they're elected from, and they kind of go on pet projects and get excited about something or not. And so, not that I'm opposed to making it more nuanced, but I do think that it would be helpful for this committee to think about how do we create the necessary zoning changes for more housing statewide in the context of local control. And I'm not confident that we're going to do that from a stick standpoint. So I would probably want to spend more time trying to figure out how do we get the carrot aspect of housing from, or at least from this organization, because I don't see them changing, and if we move away from local control, yeah, I just don't know how effective it's going to be. I understand the point. I guess to summarize, the efforts that I would love to see are ones that are focused on carrots from like money back to municipalities that do build density, and not a mandatory, more like the Fed organizing speed limits and drinking ages with highway funding,
Right.
rather than saying that, Barrington, you have to allow fourplexes, because I just don't think that they are. I think that's going to end up having, more people push back on it. But I'm happy to note that this hurts many, like maybe if they're, during the adoption of these, something to say, while support local control, the current view towards housing has a negative benefit on many of the communities that are building housing, while others are not taking their fair share of the housing.
I have a procedural suggestion that might hit both of these. So the proposed principles could be approved, but I've put up on the screen page 10 of the actual policies. And that policy,
That they advocate.
there's
inclusion.
housing, but then the opposed legislation that limits municipal control in implementing statewide priorities in zoning and land use regulations. We could object to that and ask that that be stricken at the conference, or add as it relates to housing. You can make amendments to these policies. So that might be one way to sort of accept the general concept, that
Right.
local control is good, but at the conference itself, note Portsmouth's concern and actually throw an amendment on the floor for consideration when it comes to that section, if that seems to work.
That seems to work for me. I mean, so this is where I'm struggling, is that,
Right.
Portsmouth we're working really hard to make changes that allow for building more housing, but our neighbors aren't necessarily doing the same. And that puts us in a tough position. We have to carry that weight, that burden, whereas I would like to see, for some of these towns that say, well, we want 3 acres for every house, and we're going to not allow additional housing, that puts the rest of us in a tough place to make up the difference. And so it'd be nice if the state could say, hey, and New Hampshire Municipal Association wouldn't lobby against that.
You can't exclude multifamily housing,
Right.
or you can't make your zoning, as Rye does, so difficult for multifamily that it's basically impossible.
Mhm.
So if that's an option.
So which one I found the page, so slow on this.
Yep, so we're talking about the principles right now, the 1
under
through
land
12.
use,
So if we approved the principles as written, we could move on then to the policies and suggest an amendment to that section.
On land use
Yeah.
specifically, okay, and which
Yeah.
one are we not supporting in this?
There is an oppose under land use on page 10, and it says legislation that limits municipal control in implementing statewide priorities in zoning and land use
That
regulations.
doesn't necessarily speak against statewide, so legislation that limits municipal control in implementing statewide priorities in zoning and land use regulation. That is, that seems like like it's nuanced because the ADUs, were statewide, and then it allowed each municipality to kind of figure out how they're doing it. And some communities make it easier and some make it harder. So to further nuance that one would probably mean to take away that aspect. But this one on its face doesn't necessarily speak against, statewide zoning changes. So new state mandates requiring municipally, so I would, maybe we would speak against the new state mandates requiring municipalities to allow specific types of housing. Under the-
Maybe, yeah, strike that or oppose that.
Oppose that from a standpoint of, this is, we have some mandates here. We should, it seems like overly, I guess like the first thing would say would be overly wordy to have two things try to say the same thing when we still have local control for implementing statewide mandates, which we have statewide mandates on multiple things, and we still maintain local control on their implementation.
Right.
That seems like as best to split the baby on that one. And then maybe under land use, push something to New Hampshire MA supports the legislation and policies that take into consideration the value of conservation, natural resources, and open space. That's great. That's a new one.
Right, right. So,
Support that. Oh, Jane, you were going to say something?
yeah, so we can get to all these policies, but first, we need to vote whether or not we approve the proposed principles, and then we can move into these policies
Okay.
and make these suggestions and for the conference.
And I'm fine with that, approving the principles if we can go back and say, but don't do this.
Nuance it
Yeah.
through the actual legislative policies. Okay. So would there be a motion to approve the proposed principles?
So moved.
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so now we can go, we might want to start on page 9, because those are new policies relative to housing. There are 3 these are new, so we could look at those, and then we could look at the land use proposals on page 10 and kind of look at them globally, and then see if we want to make any amendments or approve.
Do we want to go through, I mean, I certainly appreciate that, but I figure can we just go through all of them? So-
Of course, I just didn't know if you wanted to close.
Why don't we
your
just, we'll start at the beginning and go
Okay.
through all of them.
On a tour.
Yep.
Take us on a tour. Fine. Okay, so thank you for that on the principles. And now we're on the first page, which is the general administration and governance and local authority, which we were just talking about. The only new language is on the 3rd bullet under supports, and they added the language with appropriate employment protections to preserve the statutory independence of the office. Doesn't apply to us anyway because it's towns. So when it's town stuff, I don't really concern myself with it. But other than that, these policies are the same as 2 years ago, which the committee approved.
Not seeing any disagreement. And then under opposition,
The first one is new, repealing or further limiting existing governmental immunity protections or liability caps or otherwise expanding potential liability for cities and towns. As you all know, there has been increasing support each session with removing immunity for government protections for elected officials, volunteers, and municipalities in general. So this is a new policy that was proposed this year, so that that NHMA can actively lobby against these bills, which keep coming forward each session.
seems reasonable.
Okay, and then we can want to just do all the general administration and governance first. We'll just
Yep.
keep going, okay? The right to know. There are only 2 changes to this from last year, and those are also highlighted in yellow. One was in the first bullet, adding the phrase "protecting taxpayer dollars and potential privacy concerns of citizens." You will be hearing Monday night about the change in the law of right to know and a recommended policy that will be requested to go to fee committee on the ability to charge. The other change in that law is it encourages municipalities to reach out to the requester to have a dialogue so that we can attempt to limit or define what the right to know request is and make certain exceptions for the new fee, which you'll hear more about on Monday, for the press and for the indigent and that. So I think this protecting taxpayer dollar and potential privacy concerns of citizens, the taxpayer dollar is trying to reach that, those voluminous requests and having an ability for a municipality to recoup over 250, after 250 documents, whether it's electronic or not, you can charge a particular amount. So that is new language. And the other one is the third bullet, the ability of municipalities to directly petition to the right to know law ombudsman. As it's written now, the person requesting can appeal, but there isn't the same protection for a municipality, and it could be quite helpful because, again, these requests are complex, and to get clarity or to be able to resolve issues before, they get too large to address or too complex. So that would be an ability for towns and cities to, bring something forward to the ombudsman to address. But other than that, the principles are the same. Any questions on those?
It's just, we have to, I come from the standpoint of public records really have to be open, and I get nervous when we get a dollar amount per record, because I think that really discourages access.
Well,
In the
Well, that's
we're
not.
gonna talk about Monday.
Yeah, that's not this, but that's
Right, it
a
says
potential
$1 per-
recommended, that's a recommended policy for the fee committee to consider. I think it says up to $1.
Right,
if I'm
it's
not
up to
right.
$2.50, and that's the
Yeah.
way that access is guaranteed. But once you set a price on a document, it's, government will want to say, well, $2.50's, we want to make it 100, or we want to make it.
Well, a price exists on the document in and of itself because the effort required to retrieve it. We pass that cost on to taxpayers instead of the individual asking for it.
True.
At the moment. And we now, the carve-outs for the indigent and
The media.
and the press, press is seems pretty broad in terms of what that could be. But that, again, is a conversation we'll have
Yeah.
Monday. Okay, seems like this is reasonable on this one. Bigger fight will be on Monday night. I'm not expecting a big fight.
Larger discussion.
A larger discussion.
Animated large
All we have to do
discussion.
is refer to the fee committee.
Yeah, that's right. we
Right,
do,
right.
which
And then
you
it'll be at
serve
the fee
on.
committee. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. Elections, there are no changes at all to the policies from 2 years ago. Labor employment, they are also the same as before. For substance use prevention and response, the only addition is emergency response added to the supporting of state funding for addressing substance use disorders, which you can say, it just broadened it briefly, and I think it was implied before, but I think they just wanted to state it. And then NHMA opposes. So this is where last year, I believe, 2 years ago, Mayor, we had some concern about the language on these principles opposing cannabis, particularly as it related to increased police presence, or there was some concern that language was implying that there would be a need for such a thing. And I think we did a floor amendment to edit some of this language that failed 2 years ago. The only changes in these policies is on the third bullet and the third sub-bullet. the language was added for establishments engaged in selling, distributing, growing, or storing cannabis or cannabis products. So they just broaden the definition. But other than that, these principles are the same. And I think the language that we addressed was at the end of that paragraph, the security measures for premises and agreement to fund police detail. And I think we discussed that as a committee last year. I don't know if we have concerns on that this year or not.
Seems, any concerns?
No?
At the moment.
Okay. So that was the slate of the general administration and governance policies. So do you want to entertain a motion to pass those?
So moved?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so now we're moving on to the finance and revenue, which is page 5. I'm sorry, I'm not keeping up with the, but we all have our printed copies, so that's good. It's a bit faint on the screen, so I think. There we are. So there is only one change under the property tax and related revenue, and that's the very last bullet, which is just requesting a study commission. It says of local enabling legislation. I think it means for local enabling legislation to allow for a uniform homestead exemption for resident owners on the principal place of residence, which is something I think the mayor has mentioned to me many times over the last several years to address the homestead issue. So other than that, there are no changes to that, and there are no changes to those policies that are at the bottom of the page regarding opposing particular legislative principles. For state aid and non-property tax revenue, there are absolutely no changes in either the policies that support or oppose from 2 years ago for that. And then for the retirement system, there were absolutely no changes to any of those policies from 2 years ago. For education funding, there were changes to the last 2 bullets on page 7 on what policies NHMA would oppose. And those are education funding changes that would directly result in a reduction of the amount of municipal state aid and revenue sharing, and education funding changes that create a conflict in statute with any other taxing authority, state statute, existing exemption, or credit, or create technical issues with the tax collection process. So I think the last one is clearly some issues that were raised in the Rand case, because the court said there's an injunction, you must immediately remit excess SWEP to DRA, and there was no statutory scheme or a means by which to collect those. So I think it's not exactly Rand, but I think it might be influenced by the conversations that were started once that decision came down. So those are the finance and revenue policies.
Good.
That's good.
So do we want to
Are we gonna
have a
pass all
motion for
these?
those?
Yep, I'd wait a motion to pass finance and revenue.
So moved?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, great. And moving right along to infrastructure development and land use. For the policies in support, the only edit was just a minor language change to say, in the very last bullet, to promote environmental justice. I think the language before was more addressing disenfranchised communities, so I think it was just truly an edit. And then the principle in opposition was the same as 2 years ago. For water resources, protection, control, and management, there's just, again, some language, some strikeouts in the first bullet. But other than that, there are no changes to those policies that are listed from 2 years ago. The same is true for solid waste management. And where there are changes is in housing, as we just were talking about. So the NHMA has recognized, obviously, as we all have in the state of New Hampshire, that there is a real need for workforce housing and housing for homeless. So in their subcommittees that work on these principles, they brought forward these three new legislative policies to support. And it's the second bullet, adding financial incentives to municipalities to encourage develop not only affordable and workforce housing, but also not limited to municipal per unit grants. So that's an addition. Also, the third bullet, financial and other incentives to assist homeowners in FEMA designed flood areas, such as with the elevation of residential dwellings, which I know is something of great concern here in the city. And, you know,
Mr. Cook's getting stilts there.
you know, it's extremely important. We saw, you know, these past winter storms, and so, you know, again, broadening, you know, what the needs are in the state in responding to recent events. The fourth bullet, legislation that provides state funding to the Regional Planning Commission that helps municipalities in meeting their housing needs. For the most part, they're advisory, but they do a lot of hands-on. They can help with master plans, and you can well imagine with some of these smaller towns, they don't have the resources, and so there are a lot of special projects, housing needs assessment. So they have a broad menu of services that they provide. So this would allow the state to give funding to these regional planning commissions. And the bullet after that, it just adds homelessness and folks at the risk of homelessness to that particular provision. And the principles, the remaining principles and those in oppose are the same as 2 years ago. And now here we're back at the land use section that we were just talking about when we were talking about the principles. So the changes under land use are the third bullet, which is legislation and policies that take into consideration the value of conservation, natural resources, and open space. So that, again, responsive to citizens' concerns. That's something that now, if supported by the membership, NHMA will be able to lobby in favor of that type of legislation.
So on that, can we add one that said legislation and policies that take into consideration the value of housing?
In-house, and what do you mean, takes into consideration the value of housing?
Increasing the supply of.
Well, just like the value,
I
I don't
see.
think we have to say anything, just like the value, just as we're taking into consideration the value of conservation, natural resources, the value of housing. So the housing elements, the only issue I have with the housing elements is that they are, they're kind of outside not outside the scope, but they're further down the chain of what has to happen for a municipality to get money based on, a unit has to be constructed. But what I'd like to see is, if it's possible, to increase or have funding tied to zoning changes that are made on the local level that allow for housing, or tie funding for any number of reasons to zoning changes that are made to enable housing, regardless of whether or not housing is built there. So like, Newington, if, they were to look at the Fox Run Mall and have housing, being allowed use there, then fantastic, and they get a certain amount of state aid because of that. And if they choose not to have, a portion, of buildable areas, not allow housing, there's an equal lack of funding that goes towards something like that. So if it could be, just from a land use standpoint, and I don't know, maybe it doesn't have to happen here, but it seems like from a land use, this would be speaking to the carrot that allowed communities to make decisions based on allowing housing.
So we'd want to just add that as a separate bullet and do that as an amendment at the conference?
Yeah, as a separate bullet, not necessarily tied to the open space one, but the legislation and policies that take into consideration the value of housing as a land use and allow for the incentivization of municipalities who zone for its allowance.
Let's say policies that take into consideration.
Or however you could church it up,
Yeah.
Jane.
It's almost like the legislative policy that take into consideration the value is housing as a regional resource.
Yeah, okay.
Is
yeah,
that kind of
sounds-
what you're heading at?
Sounds churched up.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think that could be it, yeah, as a
Oh, no,
regional.
and so at the policy, when these come forward, we can add that and see what happens. And then we can advise the council that we've made that change on Monday. So do we want to take a vote on amending?
Yep. We had a motion to amend as presented.
So move.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So that would be presented verbally because the packet's already saying approve the policies and principles because of the deadline for the agenda. But I believe it's under the assistant mayor's name to bring forward the legislative report back. If she happens to be out, I will be probably.
This is being recorded.
Yeah. Okay, great. So that's that. Other than that amendment,
Then under the opposes section, can we make that other additional amendment to,
do you want to do it under housing or do you want under the opposition?
under the land use?
Yep.
New Hampshire opposes those last two, actually, between new state mandates and all other statewide land use mandates. Both of those seem very broad.
So what kind of language do we want to strike those or do we want to just nuance them a little bit?
Sorry, what was this?
This was our earlier discussion about kind of carving out as an exception for the opposition for statewide, statewide zoning changes.
Yeah,
Softening
I would try
these.
I would try to knock out the second bullet saying, legislation that limits municipal control in implementing zoning and land use regulation. If we carve out, if we knock out the second one, which I do not think is going to pass, but it'll come after the conversation on the supports, so we won't have ruined our goodwill at that point. But I don't think it's going to pass, but I think the point is the point that we're trying to make is legislation that limits municipal control in implementing statewide priorities in zoning and land use regulation, allows for all of the local control that we need, and reflects that the state might make decisions that affect all of us because we are a state and not, what is it, principates? Like, what are we, like we're not like our own fiefdom. So I think if with that we could arguably continue to have local control even while enacting statewide mandates, but I very much doubt that this will change, but it's
Right.
good to.
So you want to strike the last two
Yeah.
bullets?
That's what I would do. Because the last one says essentially the same thing as the middle one.
Yep.
All other statewide land use mandates.
And then
That's
keep
like
the first?
Yeah.
Okay.
the first one.
Strike last two.
I think the mayor's found a nice balance here, because it's saying, well, you can enact these, but just give us the opportunity to figure out how to implement them locally.
Okay, so a motion for that?
I move to strike the last two segments under opposes and land use.
As an amendment at the conference.
Yes.
Yes.
Second?
All in favor? Aye.
Great. Okay. Next section on IT, there's the new section on AI. No surprise there, right? Saying that we can use it, but we just need to be responsible and careful. And the only thing that's different from 2 years ago under opposes is legislation that would promote discrimination in the administration of government, the violation of privacy of the citizens we serve, or create or promote threats to public safety. And that is the only change there. There are no changes to transportation from 2 years ago, and there's no changes to economic development, recovery, and vitality. And that is it for that section of, and the last section of the legislative principles. So we
Motion from us on?
yes, on the infrastructure development and land use section.
I move to adopt as amended.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Great.
Thank you, Jane.
All right, and moving right along, there were the two floor policies. One was from the city of Lebanon, and this is talking about ed funding. What it would do is it would add that bullet in bold, and I'll just let you say it. So rescission of the tax cuts in the interest and dividends tax, business profit tax, and business enterprise tax, and the revenue from the restored taxes to be added to the education trust fund. And then it opposes reduction in state taxes that could be used to address the education funding issue in the state, such as interest and dividends tax, business profit tax, and the business enterprise tax. So what it's basically, I think, saying is that there's an undue burden on the property tax for education. If you're going to, please restore the reduction in these taxes, and restore what you've reduced, and please don't reduce further, so that only a portion of these taxes go into the education trust fund to fund education.
And sorry, where is this?
It should be at the end of the policies and procedure packet. Well, they're not there.
I don't have it.
We just got the NHMA stuff.
Let me look and see.
Is it
where
what you sent us?
That's what I was just looking.
There it is.
Okay, don't have this one, but it's fine.
Okay. So the bold, yeah, would be what is being
And this is what
requested.
Lebanon is asking for?
Yes. And once again, NHMA does not lobby on the education funding issue because members vary differently as far as sort of the donor and receiver. But this really isn't talking about donor-receiver. It's talking about maintaining a certain level of funding with the taxes that all pool into the education trust fund. And if you're continually reducing the portion of the pie that comes from interest and dividends, business profit taxes, and business enterprise tax, you are then more reliant on property tax
Sure.
for the
Right.
education trust fund.
I think this
Yeah.
could be said more simply, and just in that taxes can be cut only after meeting the obligation to education funding, but this is fine. I don't think that I would have any, be interested to see if the community has or committee seems okay.
Well, there've been a couple of rounds of those cuts, right?
Yes, yeah.
In the
Oh.
governor's budget.
Yep, over the years, yes.
There's a lot of cuts when we had surpluses from COVID and,
Right.
what have you. But those are going to be gone, and the court
Right.
case is going to come due.
Right,
Right.
and the argument is, oh, these help businesses grow in the state. But I agree with Lebanon.
Yeah.
The businesses are still going to grow, and it's still a low-tax state.
it's a very low-tax state when it comes to business and interest and dividends tax. So I have no problems with this,
Okay.
honestly.
Want a motion?
Wait, a motion to support as amended?
So moved?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, great. Moving on to the last floor policy. And moving it on the screen for you. Here we are. So it supports the prevention of the disposal of municipal solid waste or other waste generated outside of New Hampshire in New Hampshire landfills. They are also requesting NHMA support in encouraging the state of New Hampshire to act expeditiously to plan for near long-term municipal solid waste disposal as well as waste reduction initiatives. And that's in essence what they are proposing, sort of New Hampshire first. And the explanation is that, you know, as it says on the screen, I don't know if you can read the whole thing. I'll move that up a bit. Take a look at that.
I've been following this, and, you know, the idea that we have large corporations that would like to locate solid waste facilities in New Hampshire because the land is less expensive. It's easier to do here, and there could have been support at the state level, I think is a little bit disheartening for local municipalities that are highly impacted. And at the same time, the state has said that it's a priority to reduce solid waste. But we haven't passed the enabling legislation we need to make that happen. We can't even adopt a skip the stuff ordinance because we don't have enabling legislation to just ask people to reduce plastics. So it seems, I think this is a reasonable request, given that we can't even pass legislation to reduce our own waste production in the state. The idea that we're taking on others is difficult.
And what's the benefit of taking outside trash?
It's just money.
Money for landfills that exist that are operating privately?
Yeah.
Okay.
Big companies like Waste Management.
Yeah,
I
okay.
think
And then-
Casella was the most recent one,
Okay.
wanting to establish one in the north.
But that just raises our price to pay, correct?
You mean for our own disposal?
Yeah, because we're competing with more people with a limited resource. It's not lowering the price.
Well, what they were wanting to do is bring in trash from Vermont and Massachusetts,
Yeah,
and not necessarily take on more of our trash.
right.
So-
But that would, the competition, for like, by opening up the competition outside of the state, you know, this would allow for those prices to conceivably go up, not down.
I'm not sure, because the landfills are owned and operated by the waste companies, right?
Mhm.
So it's not like we're competing for tipping fees. Casella says, here's cheap land and lighter regulation. Let's put it here.
Okay.
Right. And I think the concern was really leaching into water supply in that
Okay.
area. And because we have lighter regulation in New Hampshire, it is easier to establish than it is in Vermont, say, waste facility that maybe isn't adequately planned when it comes to water resources.
Okay. Seems reasonable to support.
I just don't know enough about it. It's certainly nothing within city limits. I guess it's whether it impacts our costs.
In the explanation here, the sponsor, Waterville Valley, does say competition for the limited waste disposal resources drives up costs for New Hampshire municipalities, thereby increasing local taxes, but that's their explanation for what it's worth.
Okay, so
So then we allow other states to dump here too. That increases the competition for localities and increases our costs.
Yeah, okay.
Is there a motion?
I move to support this initiative, I guess,
What town was it from?
Waterville Valley.
from Waterville Valley.
Is there a second?
Second?
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain?
All right, so those are the policies. Thank you so much for moving
Did
through
it, Jane.
those. And I can quickly update the group on the Coalition Communities 2.0 annual meeting. I had hoped to present the memorandum of understanding that we usually get the council to approve, but the annual meeting was continued. And that was because no major changes in our memorandum of understanding, no major changes in anything except there was a proposal at the annual meeting to change how the participating 23 communities are allocated the cost to fund the lobbying efforts and the legal fees that the coalition pays on all the municipalities' behalf. So it was the town of Hampton suggested that how it is assessed now is we take our 23 communities and we add up the equalized assessed property value, and that's the total. And the percentage of that total for each town is what they pay of the total budget proposed by CC2, and that's how it's been since its inception. The proposal from Hampton was to actually add up the excess swept that's retained from all of the participating communities, and then a portion, whatever the percentage of that total is, have the various cities and towns participate and contribute according to that percentage. They did not have a formal proposal on that. It was just sort of a discussion. So the joint board and members decided to continue the annual meeting to see what that actually would look like as far as numbers and how it would change the contributions, and the towns participating. So that was interesting. The other issue was sort of in this, there were several education funding bills relative to SWEP that went to interim study. 3 that were voted on Ways and Means this week to bring forward legislation on. 2 of them were excess SWEP bills, so which would require cities and towns to pay the excess swept into the trust fund rather than retain it. The explanation from the lobbyists was that Ways and Means felt that because of the 2 pending cases, they wanted to recommend these insofar as having a vehicle for legislation in the event that the court cases came down and there was something that was required of the legislature. I don't think it was due to tremendous support for the concept. I think it was more of a procedural issue, according to the lobbyist. It's not binding, so it'll come forward for the interim studies recommendation. I think they're due November 1st. So that was the information on the legislation. They're also trying to meet with both gubernatorial candidates, some of the members of the joint board, just to say, hello, this is who we are, these are our concerns, and that was in the works of being scheduled. And there was a survey sent out to folks running for office, and they're going to do a follow-up survey on the education funding issue. So that was the update there. The joint board meets monthly, but the membership meets once a year, so they'll continue the annual meeting with its membership, I believe, for the November date. And when that happens, I'll bring forward the MOU to the City Council for for approval to continue on. But I thought it would be good to update you on that. The other update that we received is a brief update on the litigation, the education funding case, specifically the RAND case from John Mark Turner, who is the attorney for the CC2 communities. So briefs have been filed by the plaintiffs, who are now the state of New Hampshire and the coalition communities. It flips because those entities appealed the matter to the Supreme Court because, as you know, the court order on the RAND case was an injunction for communities to immediately send the excess SWEP to the state. The appeals are technical, so John Mark doesn't think that the Supreme Court is going to remand these for further hearings back at the Superior Court level. They're really, the CC2's appeal basically talks about the taxation and why SWEP was found unconstitutional is because taxes have to be reasonable and proportionate, equal in value and uniform in rate under Part 2, Article 5 of the New Hampshire Constitution. And that is the section of the Constitution that these matters were brought forward under. But the argument from the state, AGs, which support and are the same as our council, is that the SWEP rate is reasonable and proportional and equal as applied to every citizen. It's the same. But what the court looked at was the local tax. And because the local tax rate for education fluctuates so much, and the donor towns are able to keep the excess, the argument is that the effective tax rate is different because it's sort of, the argument is that supplements or reduces that particular donor town's tax rate. So the argument is really that the rate and the provision of the Constitution that was argued is fine. I mean, the rate's equal. And what you're really talking about is how the state spends that money that it collects, which is a different legal argument, different statutory schemes, different Constitution considerations. So that's sort of the technical argument for that. And there's a lot more to it, but in essence, that's CC2's argument. On the Convail case, that too was appealed by the AGs, and that's the one that increased the base adequacy substantially from $4,000 to almost $8,000, doubling it in essence.
Right.
So there are really a couple of arguments, legal arguments, technical arguments. The first and foremost from the AG's office is separation of powers. So here you have a judge changing the adequacy amount, literally in the order, saying, you now all have to pay X. Well, that's a legislative function, not a judicial function, to actually decide what that amount is going to be. So there's a lot in the plaintiff's brief that I was able to look at that really argues that separation of powers and sort of how does that bode for taxation cases moving forward. The second argument, which is also a technical argument, is, the adequacy is one statutory provision out of a pie of provisions that fund education. There's state aid for building. There are all these other regulatory definitions and also statutes that pull money for schools. So the argument is that, adequacy as defined, they did not prove that adequacy as narrowly defined and the funds raised for that were insufficient or unconstitutional. And then the evidence, and then the third is, what was the evidence presented to get that magic number for the new adequacy? And the state's arguing that the evidence presented and the numbers that were used were not appropriate or correct. So that is like the elevator speech on hundreds and hundreds of pages and very complicated funding. But just so you know, those briefs have been filed. There was an amicus brief filed by this Speaker, I think, to try to overrule Claremont in general, but it's filed very late in the game, and there's objections obviously filed to the timing of that filing. I haven't read it. I haven't seen it yet, but, and then the defendants will be filing their briefs at the end of this month, and then oral arguments will be between 3 and 6 months after that, and then the decision will be probably 3 or 6 months after that. So it's probably going to be a full year from now until we get a decision on these education funding cases, approximately, as far as I know.
So do we think that if there are changes, they would impact our financial year 2026? Is that what we're thinking?
I'm terrible with fiscal years and what means what. It depends on how the court rules on that, on the injunction, obviously. That is, there are and there's nuts and bolts impracticalities in the court order. How does this happen, right? And it will require legislation one way or the other, because, as I stated before, there needs to be a means by which these are collected. There needs to be a fund. There needs to be regulatory and statutory provisions that are amended. And how does that get done through a court order? Typically, these education funding cases had times built in, ramp-up times and things like that. So, I mean, if the court supports, the underlying decisions and agrees there should be an injunction, then it could have a fiscal impact once that decision comes down. I would defer to Nathan, to kind of noodle out how that impacts and what that is, but, anything could.
All the towns would have to.
Yeah, and
money at town.
exactly, and that's
Right.
that's the problem, because they have no way of knowing. And how do you allocate for? Yes, exactly. Which were arguments which have been made throughout all of this, all of these proceedings. So it is. It's a very complicated issue, and
So Jane, on the, hadn't really thought about state education funding for a bit now, but it wasn't until we started going through our own zoning changes that I've recognized as the zoning changes that we make in a municipality affect the value of that underlying asset or the land, as then defined by the state and collected by the state. How, I guess, has there been any arguments made as these proceedings have gone on that we are essentially trying to apply a flat tax across many different municipalities that have chosen one way or the other to allow for the value of their land to be either undervalued as, a highest and best use, or overvalued? And not to pick on Newington, but, our neighbors in Newington are also, they are disincentive for a couple reasons, I suppose, in making, say, the Fox Run Mall a residential. One of those would be, it would be much more valuable to them and potentially have to pay more education taxes or education funding taxes. So has there been ever a argument made that the zoning that municipalities enact has a effect on the value of the land, and thus collectively collecting a flat rate against all of that cannot be adequately equal because the decisions made by each municipality prevent it being, if it was state zoning, I'd understand that we would have a flat tax against the state zoning, but we don't. We have individual towns making those decisions and affecting the rate or the value of their land.
I didn't attend all the arguments, and I'm going to say generally no. I don't think that specific argument was made. I think it was mostly taxation, just the straight taxation, not the we create our own value sort of argument by our zoning. But there certainly has been an acknowledgement that different communities deal very differently, and certainly historically, those arguments were made with other education funding issues historically. So, but no, I don't recall, but I will double check and look at the briefs again to see if that was woven into the arguments. But I don't believe that has been one of the main issues in the appeals to date.
And it always come back to current use and
Yes.
the difference in terms, because Jan has pointed that out, the different communities that have different, current use. And one was once in Concord, and what is Representative Tim, what's his last name, from Durham?
Durham? I can't remember either.
But he mentioned that Durham was not a donor town, and that's something to do with the fact that 40% of their land was in current use, whereas less than 4%. And current use does, it affects both the education component and the non-education component of that. So,
Right. But in the meantime, they have faculty that are couch surfing because they can't find housing.
yeah.
So there are real challenges around that.
Okay, so thanks for the update, Jane. Is there anything that we need to do? That just
No, just keeping you posted, and more will, as the other briefs, as the briefs are filed at the end of the month and review the amicus brief, we'll meet again and I'll give you updates as we move forward. So now we're on to discussion of legislative issues of interest for the city, and I believe, Councilor Tabor, you had some issues relative to net metering you wanted to bring to the committee's attention?
Yeah, I to Jane, net metering is fundamental to the economics of solar on your house, or if it's a larger array. And the PUC had a comment period, and in their hearings, they're talking about drastically reducing net metering payment and sort of undoing that policy, which would be really knock the pins out from under the solar industry. It's not clear what they're going to do. They're going to rule in October. But they seem excessively concerned that net metering creates more cost for everybody else. On the other hand, a coalition of the Conservation Clean Energy New Hampshire, the utilities, all of the utilities, they've reached a settlement and proposed to the PUC, keep this as it is for 2 years while we figure out how to improve it. And we don't know which way it's going to go, but if the PUC rolls back some of net metering, David Waters from Dover and others want to jump in with a legislative solution. So I just wanted to put it on our radar. I think it's an important issue. And if we can help, if the PUC does get fairly regressive on this, I'd hope we go up and lobby on it. That's it.
And there are finally some wrap-ups on bills. They're still kind of chugging out there. They're mostly resolved. The NHMA has put forward their publication on updates on what finally passed and what the impacts of that is. There's several webinars that I'll be also viewing, but at the next meeting I'll provide an update, sort of the best, what is it, top 10 or whatever of the bills that
or worst.
or the worst of impact. Many of what we tracked, didn't come to fruition, but there were quite a few that that we track, that, we'll come back. And you never know with elections how things are going to go. So you always keep the issues that you're interested in moving forward. But I'll bring that back next session for timing issues, and we can talk about some bills. You've already learned about the Columbus Day. Right to Know will be Monday. Just briefly, there's some planning ones that might affect planning and zoning. One is about creative parking solutions, which I think we already consider. That bill did pass. And then also, what isn't a butter for a ZBA appeal? There's been some changes, more definition to what that entails. It doesn't actually affect decisions, but it affects who is standing to appeal. And then the building code bill basically wipes out all local amendments. Long story short, we will be presenting our amendments. The bill basically says you can't, no more local amendments. I'm really paraphrasing here. In the middle of the review period, the iteration of the codes changed. So now we find ourselves going to present for just consideration, even though the bill is very confusing about how one vets these before the Building Code Review Board, what our local amendments are, given what the new code will be, before we bring to council any changes, because what we think is that, and what we've heard, is that those who have brought amendments forward so far to the review board haven't heard back on whether or not their amendments have been approved. So we are watching and waiting a little bit, and we'll be getting advisories from NHMA on these and some other issues. So we've been talking with our inspection folks. As of right now, by operation of law, the amendments are not effective, but we are going to be presenting information to see how it is received, and then take further steps if we can on amending our own codes, if we can. And that's all I have.
What's happening with raising the eligibility for the education freedom accounts? Is that?
I have not been tracking that on the education freedom accounts, but I can look it up and report back.
I had a request from my local state rep that if we wanted anything drafted, that he would be happy to introduce something for us. So if we had any.
When is the deadline for that?
It's a while. There are some
because
that
of
are.
elections. It's
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, it's
Elections.
election, yeah. So
Jeez,
we've got time, but
It's
it
running
probably
out.
makes sense. I don't know if we want to have a meeting with the reps.
Maybe, he's running unopposed, so.
Yeah, it might make sense to have a meeting following, is anybody running opposed?
I think there's one that's running opposed, maybe.
Why don't we do it before the end of the year?
Okay.
In November,
Late November. or-
late November, before
Okay.
Thanksgiving,
Okay.
to have an opportunity to set
Yeah.
out our priorities, and we'll schedule we can probably schedule without jinxing them at the moment, but to try to get that in November before the holidays.
Great, I'll work on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
We had a motion to adjourn.
So moved?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.